Eacop ni mradi wa bomba la mafuta ghafi la Afrika Mashariki linalojengwa kutoka ziwa Albert, wilaya ya Hoima nchini Uganda, kwenda Chongoleani katika bandari ya Tanga nchini Tanzania. Mradi huu una urefu wa jumla ya kilomita 1443. Mradi huu ni wa pamoja kati ya kampuni ya Total Energies, shirika la mafuta la taifa la China, na kampuni za mafuta ya mataifa ya Uganda na Tanzania. Mradi huu hata hivyo unakumbana na pingamizi kubwa, hususan kutoka kwa wanaharakati, wana mazingira na baadhi ya jamii.
The East Africa crude oil pipeline, a climate calamity which will send us further towards climate breakdown.
Zaki Mamdoo ni mmoja wa wanaharakati na mratibu wa kampeni ya Stop Eacop. Anasema sababu kuu ya kuongoza kampeni hiyo ni uwezo wa mradi huo kuchangia pakubwa ongezeko la mabadiliko ya hali ya hewa inayoshuhudiwa kwa sasa duniani, watu kufurushwa makazi yao na uchafuzi wa mazingira.
The Stop Eacop campaign is a pan-African and international campaign that's driven by a really large coalition of various organizations, social justice movements, environmentalist movements, and various groups across the globe and across the African continent who are interested in confronting and blocking the construction of the East African crude oil pipeline project for various reasons. Chief among them being, our view of the project as one which is incredibly detrimental and would play a huge role in driving the crisis of climate collapse that we are currently in. But it is also a project which has created immense harm for tens of thousands of people in the project's host countries in Uganda and Tanzania. Already with about 120,000 people being displaced, being pushed off of their lands, losing their livelihoods, as a result of the encroachment of Eacop into their communities. And so it's for these reasons that we have set up the coalition, that we are driving this campaign, to highlight the ways in which this project is an injustice, the ways in which it stands to negatively impact communities on the front lines, the ways in which it stands to negatively impact the continent, and of course, the local economies and the well-being of ordinary people.
Kwa mujibu wa Zaki, iwapo bomba hilo kwa bahati mbaya litapasuka, basi litasababisha hasara kubwa, ikiwemo maafa na majeruhi kwa binadamu, wanyama, misitu pamoja na wadudu.
So the environmental risks are immense. Of course, this is a mega project, right? If it is built, Eacop would be the world's longest heated crude oil pipeline, and it pump tens of thousands of barrels of oil each day from at least currently there's two primary oil drilling sites. The one is Kingfisher on the shores of Lake Albert in Uganda, and the other one is in the heart of Murchison Falls National Park in Uganda as well. And if Eacop is built, then it is expected that they would open up oil drilling activities in the DRC and potentially in South Sudan as well. So that entire region then becomes a site of extraction where, there would be immense drilling and exploitation of the oil reserves, pumping it into the Eacop, all for export into international markets. Now, the Eacop pipeline itself, along its route, it traverses numerous, important biodiversity hotspots. It crosses through Ramsar sites and important wetlands, where any sort of spill, any leak, any kind of pollution would be detrimental for that entire Great Lakes region, potentially even impacting Lake Victoria, which of course is an incredibly important water source in the whole of East Africa, which over 40 million people are dependent on for livelihood and for sustenance. And Eacop goes straight through the lake basin of Lake Victoria. And so any leaks there would be absolutely catastrophic. And so the environmental impacts are huge, they are immense. And it's not just speculation on our part. Of course, where we are at currently, Eacop has not been built. So we are not necessarily seeing these environmental impacts already. But we have seen them everywhere across the continent. through the colonial era up until now. We've seen them in Nigeria, we've seen them in Angola, we've seen them with the immense mining activities in South Africa and in Zimbabwe, and the gas projects in Mozambique. And so we know that where there are these, really huge extractive projects, our people benefit very little, if at all, and in fact, most of the time are pushed deeper into the ugly grips of poverty. But of course, we know that the long-lasting environmental impacts are what we are left with, what we are stuck with. And we have seen the legacies of that. We've seen the damage that causes. And so Eacop is no different to those other, colonial and now neo-colonial extractive projects which seek to enrich a few at the expense of our people.
Vuguvugu hilo la Stop Eacop limekuwa likifanya maandamano kwa muda sasa, hususan mjini Kampala, Uganda, kushinikiza serikali kusimamisha mradi huo. Hata hivyo, shinikizo lao limeangulia patupu. Hata hivyo, Zaki amedokeza maandamano yao yamefanikiwa pakubwa kwa kuwa baadhi ya wafadhili kama vile benki za kimataifa zimesitisha ufadhili wao kwa mradi huo.
What might be good to note is that the government propaganda and the propaganda of the Petroleum Authority of Uganda really tries, at least in this current moment, is really trying to tout the fact that Eacop is kind of steamrolling ahead. So they're trying to make it seem as though the project is moving ahead. And so put things out around, pipes having arrived and construction having started. But the reality is that project is far from completion. It has not, been able to secure the financial support and the insurance support that it needs in order to take off. And that is very much the result of ordinary people across the African continent, where we have solidarity movements, of course, in the project host countries, in Tanzania and Uganda, but also in Kenya, in the DRC, in South Africa, in Nigeria, where people have been coming out to the streets and, comrades standing in solidarity with them. In the US, where, many people from the Ugandan diaspora are coming out to speak up on the issue, people standing in solidarity with them in the UK, in France, in Denmark, and elsewhere across the globe, in Japan as well, coming out to make it clear that this is ultimately a project which is bad for humanity across the board. And in that, what they've been able to do successfully illustrates and show the banks and the insurance firms and corporations, at least the major ones, that this is an incredibly risky project. It is one which is not in the interest of ordinary people nor the interest of humanity. It's one which, in fact, is risky for them from a financial point of view as well. And so there are many. I think to date there's 41 major banks across the globe, who have come out. So they've either come out to make public commitments that they will not back Eacop, or they have put in place various kinds of policies that would not enable them to support such a project, in any case. And so a lot of what we try and do, of course, while exerting pressure and calling out the major players who are backing Eacop, is to collate scientific information, the expert analysis, as well as the first-hand accounts and experiences of communities impacted by the project, and to share that with financial actors, with insurance actors, and with other potential stakeholders, to make sure that people are very aware of the risks, the impacts, and the implications of such a project, and they are then able to make an educated and informed decision on whether they want to be involved or not. And fortunately, people can see this for what it is and are coming out to say, no, they want nothing to do with it.
Mbali na kufurushwa kwa makazi yao, Zaki anahoji wakazi wengi wanapitia changamoto nyingi ya kupata vyakula, matibabu, nyumba nzuri, fidia. Wengine wamefariki dunia kutokana na kuzongwa na mawazo, baadhi ya wazazi vile wakishindwa kuwapeleka wanao shuleni.
The socio-economic impacts are dire, and the conditions in communities on the front lines, have really become a lot harder since the imposition of Eacop, and since this project has come into their lives and unraveled the social fabric of their communities and disrupted their lives. Of course, among these impacts, and perhaps in some ways chief among them, is the displacement. The result of displacement is that At the socioeconomic level, families lose their land, and of course, land is the source of sustenance. Land is the income generating stream. It is what provides for these families, what enables them to put food on the table, what enables them to send their children to school, what enables them to access healthcare and all of these things. And so the loss of land is immense. And the result of that is that you have many, many, many families, countless families across the route of Eacop who are unable to send their children to school, who are not able to make ends meet and put food on the table. The threat of food insecurity has become a lot greater against that backdrop. And of course, then are also unable to bring in income to access healthcare and whatever else it may be. And even in cases where people have been compensated and there has been a compensation process, the compensation has been absolutely inadequate. It hasn't been calculated on fair rates, nor has it taken into account the true value of the land. So in many cases, families have put forward complaints that, the crops that they had on their land were not taken into consideration. They weren't compensated for it. In other cases, what you have is that on plots of lands, people are living relatively communally with their families and their extended families and within, these community structures. And that is how, in our cultures and in our societies, that is how people get by and support each other and whatever else. But what the companies have done, what the government has done, is they've identified a single head of the household. And so often what you have is, one male figure in a family of however many people receiving the compensation, while the rest of the family is completely cut out and left out of that, especially women, even though it is often women who cultivate the land. It is women who therefore add value to the land, who are left out entirely. And the result of that is that these family structures themselves begin to unravel and the social structures unravel. So that's, of course, one element of it. And there's many kind of interconnected and related crises that are beginning to emerge as a result of that. But there's other issues as well. I mean, we look at Kingfisher, where the oil drilling site there has been constructed, and its majority owner is Total Energies, but it's being operated by CNOOC, which is the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation. And in order to protect the oil infrastructure in that area, over the last 2 or 3 years or so, there has been a huge military contingency that has been deployed to the area. And the result of the soldiers coming into the communities is that there's an uptick in sexual violence, there's an uptick in the harassment, intimidation of community members. It's a fishing community, and many of the fishermen have had their boats and their equipment seized, and it's been well documented that it's been burnt and destroyed. Fishermen have been pushed away from the fishing waters that they are used to, forced to come into tense relationships then with fishing communities on the other end of Lake Albert from the DRC, because now they are competing over access to the waters, access to the space in order to fish. While the oil drilling activities have also pushed the fish populations, away from certain areas. And so the result of that, again, is that these communities have lost their livelihood. There's increased pressure, precarity in how they are able to provide. There's, tension, conflict, and violence within the communities that is emerging as well. The issues are really, really immense and vast. And, you could even go into the human-wildlife conflict, where because of the test drilling activities in Murchison Falls National Park, elephant populations are moving out of the park because of the noise. The result of that is that they are coming into communities, destroying people's crops, even been cases of community members being killed by elephants as a result of the elephants moving out of the park and being pushed out of the park essentially by the oil activities.
Licha ya kwamba mradi wa ujenzi wa bomba la mafuta linakadiriwa kutoa fursa chungu nzima ya kazi, Zaki amekiri uwepo wa ajira, lakini amedai takriban 90% ya fursa hizo ni ajira ya muda na yenye malipo ya chini mno ambayo haiwezi kidhi mahitaji ya mtu kwa muda mrefu.
I don't know why we would want to strike a balance. The reason being is that Eacop is very much an anti-developmental project. And of course, they come forward and they say, yes, It's going to create jobs. It's going to create revenue. It's going to contribute to our GDP. It's going to bring in money so that we can spearhead and drive social development projects and all of these things. And all of that is not necessarily true. And for a number of reasons. One is that, yes, okay, Eacop will create jobs, but it's going to create a very limited number of jobs. I think it's about 12,000 jobs, if I'm remembering correctly, that Eacop is projected to create. And those jobs, the vast majority of them will only be in the construction phase. And so only while they are building the thing. Now, of course, what that also means is the types of jobs that people would get would be incredibly low paid, short-term, low paid, kind of menial labor in the construction of the pipeline. And then they'd be left without jobs after that, So that's completely flips that narrative of jobs on its head. Of course, the other thing is that Eacop poses significant risks and threats to existing industry. And in fact, the host country's most profitable and productive sites of industry, which in Uganda at least is agriculture, it's tourism, and it's fisheries. And Eacop has an impact on all three of those. Of course, you've got this immense drilling in the heart of Murchison Falls National Park, which is an important site not only of biodiversity, but which fuels and drives the tourism industry in Uganda. There's a reason why they call it the Pearl of Africa. It's an incredibly beautiful country, and this oil drilling, threatens to undermine that. You have the drilling on the shores of Lake Albert, which is already impacting, the fishing industry and fisheries in that area, impacting local livelihoods. You have the pipeline then traversing and going through the lake bed of Lake Victoria, which also has severe impacts on fisheries and on the economic activity around Lake Victoria. And of course, you have this pipeline, which is going to emit 375 million metric tons of carbon, which is going to drive the crisis of climate collapse and impacting agriculture, our ability to produce food and all of these things, right? And so the impacts on existing industry threaten to put way more people out of jobs and destroy their prospects of having work and having diverse and thriving local economies in a much bigger and extreme way than Eacop would ever promise to bring employment and to bring benefits. And in fact, we are already seeing that in the surrounding communities. We are seeing the ways in which local economies have been disrupted and destroyed, and people are struggling, and people are not benefiting in any way from the imposition of oil activities into their communities. The big issue is around the export-oriented model of Eacop, because here we have a project, like every other colonial and neo-colonial extractive project, is designed to take a crude, unrefined oil product and ship it overseas to service international markets, to service the energy needs of countries abroad, and to even fuel the military might of imperial nations in the global north and in the west. What you have here, of course, if you look at the ownership model as well, it's primarily owned by Total, which has the largest share, and CNOOC, which has a significant share as well. And then, of course, you do have the Ugandan and Tanzanian state-owned oil corporations who have a share too, about 15% each, at least in the pipeline, less in the actual oil drilling sites. But there too, the money that they would bring in from that and from that export of this crude unrefined oil.
Litakapokamilika, bomba hilo linatarajiwa kubeba mapipa 1216 ya mafuta kwa siku na kufungua uwezo wa kiuchumi kwa mataifa yote mawili, yaani Tanzania na Uganda. Kwa mujibu wa serikali ya Uganda, gharama ya ujenzi wa bomba hilo ni dola bilioni 5. Kevin Sewe, Mwanzo TV. Eacop ni